Welcome back, Tiny Kings, to the dank hollows of the mortal realms, because today we're continuing our chat about the Gloomspite Gits here in 4th edition. And in the last episode, we started at a top-down kind of look upwards at the Bad Moon and the Evil Sun as a way to introduce ourselves to the Grots as a species in the mortal realms. But today is going to be a little bit different, because a note that I hit on with gusto, hopefully, in the last video, is that this species or fantasy race that are Grots exists because of both its stubbornness, but also adaptability, which you would think would be at odds, right? Usually stubbornness means you don't change, adaptability means you do. But essentially, they bully their way into the deepest corners of the mortal realms, and then use that environment, wherever they bullied their way into, to fully reform their culture. Their mythos, their religion, their weapons, their units, the flora, the fauna, whatever is around them, all of it kind of blends together. And so today, I want to start peeling the top off of this army as far as the different archetypes within it, with the most iconic ones to star, in my opinion, are the Moonclans. Now, the Moonclans sort of a catch-all term for the types of Grots that adopted to living underground. They have a marked disdain for sunlight, even more so than others, but like, for example, the Git mobs are pretty loosey-goosey with the sun. The Moonclans, not even a little. They shroud themselves in thick, dark robes to cover as much of their skin as possible from any potential light source. They are largely agoraphobic, so much so that they could have these vast underground empires that cities recently founded on the ground above them would never know about. But the fear that keeps these Grots in the ground dissipates once the Bad Moon appears. Then they all surge to the surface to revel in its glow, and that's when everything goes wild. But my point is here that they are by far the most numerous. They are spread far and wide across the realms, and they're not necessarily easily to detect, because if they just don't interact with the surface, how would you find them unless you went way underground? And this, I think, is largely why the greater story beats of Age of Sigmar largely don't affect the Gloomspite Gits, right? Because this whole time that they've been doing this since the Age of Myth, since the sun has been in the sky, they don't care about, Age of Chaos, Age of Sigmar, there we go. The Soul Wars, the Era of the Beast, the Hour of all of that stuff passes. They're on their own timetable because they just don't have to engage. And that kind of isolation, like I said, when you are an adaptable bully in your environment, breeds a certain kind of culture over millennia. And while the Grots don't vary much physically themselves, they are largely defined by how they use the environment around them. So let's talk about this flora and fauna and the practicality of how that all comes together. Now, one thing you'll immediately notice about the Moonclan Grot range as you're looking at all the various hero miniatures is that a bunch of them are carrying or being mutated by mushrooms. In fact, fungal growths appear as a huge visual theme or a motif recurring through just about every single unit in the army, because using local funguses and spores and plants is a cornerstone of Moonclan society. These can range from anything from crafting health potions, trying to harvest them for food. On the other end of the spectrum, you can have brews that are meant to induce religious visions of Gorgamorka to define his will, or maybe predict the Bad Moon. Other potions that will increase their magical power, with possible downsides, and often, and commonly, weaponized as poisons to be used against their enemies, or subordinates who start talking too much. Now, two stellar examples, if you're looking at the model ranges here for this, is going to be one, the Fungoid Cave Shaman, who is a wizard grot who's ingested so much powerful shrooms that it's essentially erupting from his scalp. That's why he has that kind of like fungoid hat going on. It's coming out of his skull. And the other is the Gabapalooza, which is a menagerie of minor heroes that have different jobs, but characters like the Brew Git and the Boggle-Eye are great examples of having mushrooms on their miniatures and how they would use local environmental things to craft poisons or buffs or whatever they need. In fact, some species of these like fungal growths underground are so large that they can be weapons themselves rather than an ingredient. An example of this is the spore splatta fanatics, who essentially just hook a rope onto some nasty shrooms that erupt with blinding spores and then spin them around like a dervish. Now that's the thematic side. On the tabletop, this is where a lot of the fun hero abilities come from. Like, in game it might be a once per game ability, but it's representing your Grot hero chomping down on a mushroom or swigging a cocktail that he made, to give him an extra spell or something, and so on. And so I think it's an important part of the Moonclan aesthetic to discuss because it really does bleed into the tabletop in a really meaningful way. It has consistently over multiple editions. Now, kind of pivoting into the local wildlife, you should not be surprised to learn that the Grots don't live underground alone. There are plenty of other creatures down there, because of course there are. Life shows up everywhere. And amongst the wide, plethora of things living underground, there are the three big categories here, which are Troggoths, which we'll cover in a dedicated video because they make up a whole leg of this army. Insects, including spiders, which of course can also be found above ground, but, naturally caves and stuff like that make great environments for them. And the third is squigs. Of course, there are grubs, centipedes, all the creepy crawlies and stuff like that you would expect. But in terms of, living things that rule the cavernous depths, it's trogs, spiders, and squigs. It's those big, big three. With the most iconic in Warhammer, in my opinion, being squigs. And so that's where we're going to focus for this. Now, a squig, if you are unfamiliar, is a rather round, bulbous creature that is essentially half-mouth, right? Imagine if an anglerfish or Pac-Man was a biped. And I'm sure at first, the Grots were getting eaten alive, literally, by these creatures, right? Small, tight tunnels, and you're just a little guy, and what looks like Pac-Man is bearing down on you. But at some point, way long ago in their history, the Grots learned to subjugate the squig. I can't really use the word domesticate, but subjugate works better because at every level it is clear that these are wild and insanely dangerous creatures that are constantly fighting because they are very willful, right? So working around squigs in any capacity is a great way to get eaten by one. But the species that we collectively call the squigs, because there's a lot of different variations of them, ended up being a massive boost for the Moonclans and for a ton of reasons. One is, of course, as a source of food. They don't go for squigs first, typically, but they can essentially raise them like cattle, even if it tastes terrible. Secondly, squigs are a beast of burden. Anything that needs to be carried or pulled that the little guys just themselves can't cut it, there's a squig. And then they are just frankly highly adaptable themselves and can be bred to fill incredibly niche and specific uses within Grot society. Some can blow up like balloons. Others, rather famously, are bred to seek out mushrooms, represented by the unit called the Sneaky Snufflers, who are basically squigs bred to be like bloodhounds. But ultimately, one thing that is, just universally appreciated about squigs is their indeterminate growth. This also makes them fantastic mounts, kind of blending those last two ideas together. But essentially, we have a few animals like this in our own world. And really what indeterminate growth means is that as long as you can stay alive, you grow. A squig will continue to grow. There is no predetermined full size where your genes say you stop growing. Now, for the average squig, in terms of how, eager to throw themselves into battle they usually end their lives around 3 feet around, maybe a little bit bigger, somewhere between 3 to 5, because at that point, a Grot can hop on back and you can start getting into some real trouble and probably end up dead. But for squigs that happen to survive battle after battle, all they do is just keep growing, which not only means that there are a variety of squigs, but also ways that you can use them, because smaller ones, Grots will just corral forward and kind of unleash this herd wildly upon their enemies, and whoever lives does, and who doesn't, that's fine. Once they get big enough to be able to hold the weight of a Grot, they can be used as a mount. At that point, they're just wild, and so they just kind of use them to basically get Grots into battle faster. These are the squig hoppers. not so much riders as they are just kind of getting a lift, right? That's not really a rider mount situation. Some of those grots and those squigs survive the ordeal and even kind of take on a faux knighthood because, again, these squigs are getting bigger, stronger, their reliability becomes more increased. It's probably the closest thing to a professional cavalry that this faction will ever have. But because that indeterminate growth is a thing, 1 in a million squigs that manages to just not die outright can grow too big to even be ridden as a mount, and that's when you get the Mangler squig. Essentially, they're too big and unmanageable for a normal grot to be able to ride, but they're still very useful. And so what the Moonclans will do is take 2 of these huge mega squigs, chain them together, and unleash them as a wrecking ball at the enemy. Which is a nice little symmetry, right? Because if you remember when they started their lives and they were tiny, they were unleashed in exactly the same way by the squig herders. I don't know, I like the symmetry there. And so this one creature has come to define all of the cavalry and the mobile aspects, and the skirmishing aspects, really, of the faction in a huge way. You can't talk about Moonclan Grots without discussing the fact that they make huge use of cavalry, squig attacks as kind of their big hitters, that kind of thing. And so this is where these grots have found themselves, right? Underground, surrounded by poisonous dank mushrooms and squigs. What do those things make when they come together? Well, the nice thing is we probably have more insight into Moonclans than most other grot, sub-factions. They congregate in large numbers in underground caverns. They organize themselves into what we would call units, and it's purely a gang mentality. There's strength in numbers, so we'll all pull together, usually have a leader, and that group is part of the larger Moonclan ecosystem called a scrap. Now, a scrap is synonymous with warband in GW terms, right? It's this amorphous thing that we would call an army. And it could be a lot of different things. These scraps can be massive. The bigger and better the bosses that rise to the top attracts more of these little groups, meaning units, to them, and a natural power structure based on essentially bullying is built. Within this, you'll see grots rise in stature based on their physical size, their achievements in battle, the personal cult, of personality they've curated, or their ability to predict the bad moon. Whatever your collection in your closet is right now, that's a scrap. And that's just one scrap. There are hundreds and thousands of them across the mortal realms, each being a very different army that you can bring to the table. Again, based on all their belief systems, how they evolved, how many squigs are in their caves, that kind of thing. However, there's one that I want to talk about in particular. And that is, of course, takes us over to the realm of metal, Chamon, to a place called Scrappa Spill. This is, I think the best way to describe it is a state-sized city built into a junkyard. So you got lots of jagged scraps of metal, there's rust everywhere. It's essentially a giant maze of just stacked steel. And it's built atop a cavern, so it's huge and extends deep underground and so on. In this junkyard, the biggest gang around are the King's Gits, followers of Skagrot the Loon King. He is a character that definitely deserves his own dedicated video, but I want to slide him in here because he really proves the point of the societal structure, right? He's a loon boss who's lied, backstabbed, and connived his way to the top, and his big claim is that he can predict the bad moon's approach, and as such, also claim to be attracting it. How he does this is a really fun mix of lies, existential horror, and all kinds of stuff we'll cover in his video. But that solidifies his power because it tugs at the core beliefs of every single grot in the realms. Whatever they have going on their little power trip of trying to rise to the ranks and survive, being a part of their group, their unit, which is part of a scrap, all of that. Every single one of them has to pause and just be like, there's something about this guy. Whatever he's doing is working, and he has a magnetism that draws more grots to Scrappa Spill by the day. And that's how these things work. That's how armies grow. It's how factions expand and so on. And so I want to end up towards the last part of this video just discussing, why is this cool? Well, the idea of a scrap is one we'll come back to a lot, because no matter what units you take in your army, right, you can add trogs and spider riders and Git mobs, all of it's called a scrap, no matter what. And they act as a great way to design your army. Moonclans, or one of the sub-factions in a scrap, are to me the most iconic. These are the night goblins from the old world, and you got squigs, enough said. And one thing I can say about them as a faction is that they are compelling in every edition of this army. Meaning, before like the Gloomspite Gits even had a battletome, people were taking stabbas and shooters because not only are they visually iconic, but they're useful. And they have done nothing but become more useful as a keyword sub-faction throughout every single edition of this book. So if you like Moonclan, you will like Gloomspite Gits. Now there's, decisions to be made within that. Do you go squig heavy? Do you not? You can do it a lot of things. But what I love is just that this is like a core anchoring of the army, Gloomspite Gits. And then they always work. And to me, like the idea of living underground and in caves is so attractive in such a crazy fantasy setting because it means you can tell like such crazy stories with your miniatures. Like, yes, your paint scheme could be that everything's in the dark, and maybe this is a great exercise to really focus on object source lighting, where you have crazy like flames and stuff like that coming off of torches. Or you could go with wild colors, right? Just crazy teals and pinks, so your grots can blend in with their local shrooms' bioluminescence. And you can make them all look trippy. Essentially, using the army as a canvas to carve out what you want your little corner of the mortal realms to look like, because again, I can't emphasize enough, we see what their environment is mirrored through how the army adapted to it. Which is always going to make them visually interesting. It's always going to make them narratively interesting. Literally whatever environment you plop these guys in, they will be cool in that environment. They'll find a way. And to that end, I think the Gloomspite Gits, particularly the Moonclan Grots, are an excellent just part of this faction and really iconic. If you are a squig army enthusiast, right? Because there's people who just, all I want to do is the squig stuff. I am one of those people. If I was going to do Gloomspite Gits, I would just do squigs. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this particular edition. But I think one thing, no matter how you feel about squigs or whether you're going grot heavy or squig heavy, I think we can all agree this, in terms of the actual model range line, is one of the most compelling parts of the actual army, because like a lot of the character pieces, like the Fungoid Cave Shaman, the Gabapalooza, those all kind of fall under Moonclan. And while there are some really cool Troggoth models, so much of the character, like an inordinate amount of it, in my opinion, is settled into this particular sub-faction. It's vibrant, it's goofy sometimes, but also like they're menacing and scary. And again, I can't emphasize enough, go read Gloomspite if you want to see what it is like for a Moonclan army to come to life. And let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.